So, yes, I was asked a little while ago by a friend at Shropshire Wildlife Trust, who works on invasive non-native species, that's what INS means, whether there is a problem whether Shropshire has a problem with INS or not. So I just took it upon myself to look at the data and using BSBI data just as a desk-based study to see, do we have any issues here? So within the British and Irish flora, if we take Clive Stacey's flora, new flora as an example, we've got around about 3,700 species, and of those about 1,500 are considered native. So that leaves us with about 2,200 non-native species. And within that group, that large group of species, there are a group of them which are your invasive non-native species, which are on the Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And currently there are 41 species, which includes a couple of and some algae, which are on there. So this is most people's perceptions of invasives is what we maybe see on the media. There seems to be a plethora of what I almost call adverts within some of the broadsheets and the Daily Mail equivalents as well, from people writing about Japanese knotweed, and they always introduce a map like this just to show how horrendous it is. This is a map of Japanese knotweed, and the perception is it's everywhere, and I wanted to get behind a little bit of that in Shropshire. And if you were to look at somewhere like Cornwall, this is a map of Cornwall, you can see how you go from a 1 kilometre square monads in the top, where it still looks pretty wall to wall, but when you actually bore down into the data to 100 metres square, or even yeah, you can really zoom in, you'll find that actually you could buy somewhere in Cornwall, if you could afford it, that it wasn't next to knotweed. So yeah, I wanted to look at this data for Shropshire. So we'll start with introducing where is Shropshire. Some of you may not know it. Shropshire's borders right on the Welsh Marches, so we've got Wales to our west, and we've got the industrial Midlands as well, the West Midlands as well to our east. Lovely county, real mix of habitats, some uplands, some lowlands, meres and mosses, so bogs, those sort of habitats, some really nice old lakes, or the meres as well. And we have a few post-industrial areas. We're obviously the birthplace of industry with the Iron Bridge Gorge, Iron Bridges, and all of that area. So we're very lucky in Shropshire in that it has been very well botanised. It's been recorded in Leighton's Flora of 1841, we had a Sinker's Flora in 1985, and then more recently we had Lockton and Wild in 2015. So it's been pretty well comprehensively recorded. Some groups better than others. Once you start looking, there's possibly some gaps in some of the conifers, another area of interest. Once you start looking, you start seeing other species, of course. So again, does Shropshire have an invasive non-native species problem? If you plot any record of a invasive non-native species, Schedule 8 species, onto a map of Shropshire at the 10 kilometre square record, it looks like we have a problem. If we bore down a bit to a 2 kilometre square level, again a tetrad level, it still looks like a problem, and then goes to a 1 kilometre square level. Again, still looks like we've got some issues there. So it's a bit of a mixed question, yes and no so far. And those of you who know Shropshire might even be able to pick out some of the key sites. You can start to see the urban areas, you can start to see the rivers there, the canals in the northwest, which shows up very, very nicely as well. So within Shropshire, there are 571,000 or more than that over that records for vascular plants, and of those records, less than 1% of them are actually invasive non-native species, so 4,200 or so. Currently, it was interesting to see Helena's total for how many species she had in her counties, but in Shropshire we have 2,412 species present. That number is gradually going up year on year, again with aliens and species being mobile. And we're fortunate, we only have 41 out of 27 invasive species so far. So some of them, will they ever establish in Shropshire? Probably unlikely. Again, connected a little bit to Helena's talk. We have 13 species that have not ever been recorded in Shropshire, in the wild, that is. Some of them actually on the list have no current records in the British Isles, things like the giant Salvinia, which is that relative of Azolla, a floating fern relative, hasn't been recorded in the wild anywhere as yet, as from what I can see. Other species, perforate Alexanders, I've grown it in my garden. I know other people who do grow it, but it's not been recorded in the wild. And then this year, where we were talking about will things survive in the climate, I've actually lost Hottentot fig and purple dew plant. They've completely obliterated with the heavy frost that we had this year, as have my big troughs of floating pennywort. The next speaker, Prof. Ian Truman, actually gave me a plant of it a couple of years ago, and that died out, and I had to get more samples collected from the wild. So we're quite lucky in some ways in that the climate in Shropshire can get quite cold, and it has knocked off some of these species. So in this short time, I'm just going to cherry pick a few of those species that may be causing problems or are the sort of the headline species. So I've got a particular interest in aquatic plants. We've got species like Azolla filiculoides, which is the floating or fairy fern, depending on your different books. You can see it's widespread throughout the British Isles. It's a bit more southerly, a bit more in the warmer climates, but that doesn't exclude it from anywhere else. It is widespread. And again, you can start to see on the maps there a little bit of some of the river systems. You can certainly see the canal network there coming from Wales into Shropshire and the River Severn as well. So looking at, for each species, for this project that I worked on, we reviewed where the distribution map, we looked at where the species were, and I looked at how many records there were nationally and then in Shropshire. So nationally, there's 7,500 records for water fern. We've only got 66 records in Shropshire, and it was first found in a farm pond in Betton in Shropshire, sorry, in 1975 and 70, and then again in 1977, but then it was completely destroyed by a hard winter in 81, 82, which was the really hard winter that Shropshire had when it set, at the time, it set a national record for how cold. So there's quite a distance between that first UK record and the first Shropshire record of 90 plus years. So then we've just got a number of records per decade. And again, it was useful to know how many sites were there in Shropshire, and there's around about 28 sites. These aren't necessarily all still extant. Some of them have work has been going on to eradicate them, or they've just naturally disappeared. But we are supplementing the populations through work like this. You go and buy aquatic plants from a garden centre or nursery, and I've seen them riddled before now with Azolla like this. So always be wary what you're buying when you're buying plant material. And I suspect that's how many of our plants are coming in, whether deliberately or accidentally. The next example is a deliberate one. You just go to your garden centre and buy oxygenating plants, bunches of plants. And here, this is a lovely, well, there's two species there. There's a species called Elodea, canadensis in one half on the left, and on the right there's Lagaricifer major, which is curly waterweed. And that was still being sold only a few years ago. So we'll start with this species, which is in the Frogbit family, the curly pondweed. It has this really dense tufted hairdo on the top. Looks like somebody's got a really good set hair there, with beautiful recurved leaves. They're alternate, whereas most of the other species of aquatic non-invasive non-natives, they're opposite leaves. So it does stand out. And this one grows very happily in a garden pond that I've got, and just slowly builds up year on year. So again, widespread distribution. And it was first introduced actually very recently to the British Isles in 1944. It was only in 1995 when it was first recorded in Shropshire. And again, you can see a very scattered distribution. It's very widely recorded in the British Isles, but we've only got 11 current sites in Shropshire, although I know there'll be more garden ponds that we're not including in those numbers. But we've just got to be careful that we're not chucking them out from those ponds. Then the Elodeas. These are two, I find them quite attractive. They're quite beautiful when you look at them. The flowers are gorgeous little things, Elodeas. I think these are some of the least worst offenders when it comes to it. I'd much rather have a nature reserve with Elodea on than with Crassula on. It does less harm than Crassula. Not that I'd particularly want either. So nuttallii has these lovely recurved leaves. You can see how they're actually in whorls here. You've got where every point there's a node, the arrow's indicating the red node. The leaves come out in threes, and it really curves back to the individual leaves. They're a lot longer and thinner in nuttallii, and that is very, very widespread in the British Isles, all over the place. Then we compare it with canadensis. You can see here again the leaves are in whorls. They look a little bit like a propeller. They are a lot shorter. They don't tend to recurve at all really. They just slightly bent, arch back, and much more robust sticking out, I find. And I get actually quite excited when I see canadensis. I very rarely see canadensis now. It's usually Nuttall's waterweed instead. So again, much more widely recorded, so you'd assume it was everywhere, but this species is having a bit of a decline. So if we look at the data I've compiled, we can see the first British record was 1815, the first Shropshire record 1863, and that was from a bit of the River Severn. We've got a reasonable number of sites for it. That's because things like the River Severn aren't one continuous site, so we could have River Severn at Preston Montford and River Severn at Ford. Those would be two sites, so it actually bulks the numbers up a bit. But we can start to see, if I use the arrow, we've got areas like the canal is showing up nicely up there, the Montgomeryshire Canal, the River Severn through Shrewsbury showing up, an iron bridge, and so on. And then we've got Elodea nuttallii. This again is really showing up the urban areas, I find. I think you've got in the centre of the Shropshire map, you've got Shrewsbury, the capital county town, and then to the northwest you've got the Montgomeryshire Canal again picking out. A species that was only first recorded in 1942, it took 30 odd years before it was recognised in Shropshire. I suspect it was here, like in other counties, it was here before. It wasn't included in many of the major texts of the time, textbooks, so we weren't aware of it. And this is I had to look at the data over the time to do sort of number of records over the time. And you can see that Canadian pondweed has had, from records, a good crash, and it appears that nuttallii has replaced it, and that's been found in other places. I think it was Simpson in Watsonia wrote an article about the different species of Elodea and their introductions and their history, and how nuttallii displaces canadensis. And if we look at the national data, all UK records, this is clearly quite shown that the canadensis had this peak. So about 2000 it starts to drop down, and about the early 1975s nuttallii starts to take off. So I suspect nuttallii hasn't peaked yet, but it hopefully will have a lag as well and drop off. Now it's interesting to see Helena talk about the arrowheads and duck potatoes, because this is two species I'm interested in as well. We've got lots of rivers in Shropshire, and arrowheads is very common here. Duck potato fortunately isn't, and you've got these two lovely flowers. One of them, the native arrowheads, has this purple sort of boss in the middle of anthers, and the petals often have this purplish crimson colouring at the base. You can measure the achenes, the seeds as well. But for me, the duck potato looks like a poached egg in comparison. It's quite an obvious flower. And it's widely grown in gardens. That's where I've got my material from when I've been teaching. And if you dig it up, as the name suggests, it's got a sort of potato, a starchy tuber at the base. So if we can look at the distributions, you can see for arrowheads it's widespread, whereas duck potato is much more restricted in its distribution, fortunately. So in Shropshire we've got one site for it. So if we had the political will and the finances, we could actually eradicate it from these sites if that was desirable. And this is one particular site in Shropshire called Merrington Green, which always gives when you want a weird and wacky unusual alien. There's so many other garden waste dumped there. There's Alstroemeras or Peruvian lilies growing there quite happily in the roadside verge, and various other weeds as well. And then my real nemesis, the species that I think is the really one of the worst aquatic offenders, is Crassula, which I think you'll all be familiar with, widespread everywhere. And in Shropshire, fairly recent records, 1988, but in that time it's done a lot of damage, and that can sometimes be accidental or sometimes deliberate. This is a particular site I've worked at in Telford in Shropshire. They were managing all of their brick piers by the round edge of the ponds. They were managing by using a strimmer just to weed off and sweep off the sort of the paving. Surprisingly, the whole lake, a man-made lake, had only one small patch of Crassula other than on here. And the only reason I can think why it's still it hasn't established is because it was full of carp, and the carp just hoover up anything that lands on the water surface. So I'm going to jump slides a bit because I'm probably running out of time. So can we use just the data to highlight where some of the aquatic invasives are? So we've already highlighted that Shrewsbury is a hotspot for aquatic invasives. That's the River Severn and some of the local parks as well. We've got the canals, Montgomeryshire Canal, which has a lot of invasives in. Sadly, a lot of the positive plants, since the restoration making it more navigable, they've gone, but the invasives are still holding on. We've got Newport Canal, a little stub. We've got brown moss as well, which is a triple SI and a sac and all of these sort of things that, again, has an awful lot of non-natives hanging on there. And let's skip through to summary ones. So where are the top 10 invasive species concentrated? Again in Shropshire, ignoring the water ones. So again, it's the urban areas. We're lucky in Shropshire, we don't have much urban areas. Where we do, that tends to be where the knotweed is. When you go out away from those disturbed areas, it's not there. So let's skip that. So for us, I didn't have time to go over rhododendrons, but we've got more. The most recorded species of invasives is our rhododendrons on some of our hillsides, and then not surprisingly things like Himalayan balsam. All of our river networks have it, and it goes quite quickly. We get to some quite weird and wacky, slightly niche species like few-flowered leek, Allium paradoxicum. That's actually higher up the list than three-cornered leek or three-cornered garlic, depending on your common name, which I know in Cornwall is wall-to-wall, isn't it? So where are they coming from? They seem to be coming, I think, a lot of the time they're coming from horticulture, or most of the time they're coming from horticulture. Occasionally as game covers, I still see rhododendron and things like Gaultheria chalon planted in as pheasant cover and things still going on. So our experience in Shropshire, what we're trying to do is recruit expert recorders from those existing groups, so the Shropshire Flora Botanical Society and so on, getting adding value from that by getting the data validated by people like experts from the BSBI, and making sure it's submitted properly so that we can act on it. So yeah, does Shropshire have an invasive non-native species problem? We do. I think we're very, very fortunate in that we're at the very beginning of the invasion for most species. If there was the political will, the political money, we could go and hit those 1 or 2 sites. We could get rid of duck potato if we wanted to. We could get rid of, there's one site for floating water pennywort, and so on. So yes, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I think there probably are a few questions. I shall have a look in the chat.
Yes, well, there's a few questions come in. Thank you very much for that. Probably most people know that I've done a fair bit of recording in Shropshire, so I have come across some of these aliens and perhaps found 1 or 2 novel aliens, but I think the novel ones are not yet invasive, but who knows what will happen in the future. So Elaine asks, is there any evidence that flooding events have caused the water plants to be spread from flooded gardens?
I'm not sure there's exact evidence, but it's very clear that plants that are further up the stream end up down the stream. So I can think of not in Shropshire, but a site with lysochiton, which is your skunk cabbage. So yeah, that was one I'd be worried about moving. A non-invasive, but Corydalis chilianthifolia, which I can't remember what it's called. It's a yellow fumitory-like plant. And we had a big flood in Shrewsbury, and it used to be where I worked in Shrewsbury. In the gravel there, nothing really ever grew, and then it popped up one year, and I'm sure the seed just got washed down with that from the flood event. So yes, I'm sure flooding has that impact. What I'd like to see Shropshire doing, and other counties already do this, is targeting, so that we've got one site for Hydrocharitaceae floating water pennywort. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's no way it can get into a water body unless man physically digs it up and dumps it. So that's, to me, is of least concern almost, although it's a nasty species in itself. And spend our money a bit more sensibly sometimes. So what's the other question?
The other one is destruction of a population of invasive non-natives acceptable?
Yes, interesting question from Joe. We have a responsibility, people have a responsibility to actually target some of these invasive non-natives. Anything on the wildlife and countryside Act Schedule 9 you're not allowed to deliberately spread it or intentionally spread it. So if it's on your land and it's moving out, then you've got to control it. So I think some species it would be desirable, and it would be nice to not have any what's Ludwigia, I can't remember the common name, water primrose. That would be, I think, English Environment Agency would love that to disappear. Floating water pennywort as well, if we could get rid of all of those. So yes, it's some of the species it would be good to get rid of. I personally think things like in Himalayan balsam, the horse has bolted, we're never going to get that back in So, and question on knotweeds, is the Bahamica hybrid increasing with you? I haven't noticed that. We've got about 2 locations with it. One of them has gone because that was in Ironbridge. Again, most of our invasives tend to be in post-industrial areas, which is what you find a lot of the places. If you've got a pristine site, generally they're not there, unless they're water-borne, I find. Yes, the Bahamica has got, so this was Raynotia Bahamica, the Bohemian knotweed, I think is the common name. That's one of the sites gone because they stabilised the riverbank. The whole half of the town was going in the river, so they had to remove it then anyway. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's actually quite a wider question, because Dick Shaw from Cabby is quite interested in finding populations of that species. So if anybody does have current records, particularly I think in southern England, they're looking for samples to try biological control using psyllid sapsuckers. So do get in touch if you've got any of it. And yes, Mags says thanks to you, Mark. Mags is the co-recorder for Shropshire, so she has all the current records. There's one question in chat Yeah, Helena says that there's more sites for Hydrocharitaceae and Untitled in Somerset every year, and the Environment Agency's tried to control it but failed. In Cambridgeshire, actually, at least on the River Cam, at the upper reaches, they've had a really big effort and do seem to have managed to get rid of it, although I think it's still widely present in the river downstream from Cambridge.
I think with many of these species, if we could knock them on the head now, we can save those literally millions of pounds that we spend on trying to control them, and often it's not eradicate, it's control. We could spend that more wisely on other nature conservation. It'd be great to spend that funding elsewhere instead of just trying to knock whack-a-mole on some of these species. So
yeah, so get the small populations while we can.
That's it.